Welcome to Have a Life Teaching, the podcast designed for educators who are dedicated to enhancing their teaching practice and creating a positive impact on their students' lives. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the world of education, exploring a wide range of topics related to curriculum, instruction, and assessment in K-12 schools. Together, we'll learn from the brightest minds in the education field. So if you're a passionate educator who's ready to take your teaching practice to the next level, join us as we explore the exciting world of education. My name is John Schambach, signing in and saying, let's have a life teaching. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Have a Life Teaching podcast. As my listeners know, we cover a range of topics here on the show. And as my listeners also know, we've been starting to really talk about school climate and culture issues. This is an area of learning that we really need to talk more about and to infuse not only in our academics, but in the environment of our school communities. And one aspect of social emotional learning that I know many of my listeners already know a lot about is the fact that schools are doing their best to promote kids up, to bolster students, to have students feel a sense of self-efficacy, a sense of power to control their environment. And that's wonderful. But another part of social emotional learning is being resilient and being able to, quote unquote, rise from the ashes like a phoenix, to be able to rise when things don't go well. The reality is in all of our lives, some things are going to work out wonderfully, and some things, including things that we planned for, that we value, that we really have vested our souls in, are either not going to work out or they're not going to work out in the way we thought they were going to work out. I'm really excited to be joined by my next guest, Lindsay Schambach, the Executive Director of Imagine, a Center for Coping with Loss. And today we're going to talk about how we can help our students cope with many kinds of loss. And how does that fit into the world of teaching and learning? Lindsay, could you tell us a little bit more about your journey to the Imagine Center? How did you get involved in this work? And why particularly grief counseling and grief education?
I used to say I got to celebrate honor roll, and I used to get to celebrate college acceptances. And now my work is grief and loss. And they are so intrinsically tied that most of us don't realize it. We say that like every life change, even the positive ones, there comes just an ounce of loss. You can't have change without loss. You're always leaving something behind. And there's a tad of grief that shows up in those spaces. Although it seems like a really far stretch, it's not as far as we think. I started my career teaching in the Newark Public Schools, loved every minute of it. So those are my early years of teaching. And then I was lucky enough to become a charter school principal in the city of Newark. And I founded an amazing school with incredible kiddos. We grew it from 104 children to 550 children. So I experienced our babies. I met them when they were 4 years old. And that founding class of children are now juniors in high school. And my former students, when I first started teaching, they're all teachers now. They're 24, 25, 26. So it's been an incredible thing watching our kids grow up as a teacher. And over the years, I think all of us as teachers, unfortunately, experience the passing of a family member of our students. And some of us experience the death of students themselves. I've definitely experienced all of that in my 20 plus years of education. And being a relatively empathetic person, as I think the majority of us are as teachers and administrators, that we all get into this work because we love children. We want to love on them. We want to take care of them. So I did all the things I thought I was supposed to do. I showed up at the funeral. As a principal, I sent food to the family. I checked in on them. And then life went on. And then in 2017, my husband, who was 37 years old at the time, was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. And I was 34. I had a 3-year-old son. And my husband passed about 9 months, 10. And this is what grief does to you. It messes up timelines. You sort of forget the details and the dates of all of those things. But he passed, I think, 11 months later. And my son had just turned 4. I had a 4-week-old daughter. And I think that the experience that we went through really opened my eyes to how much more support I needed than I had ever given to someone before. I was the only 34, 35-year-old widow I knew. My son was the only 4-year-old I knew with a father who had died. And we were really lost as a family. Despite having an amazing network and people who loved us and cared for us, the amount of isolation and pain that I experienced and the fear that my son experienced, I realized how little support was out there and how much I needed. So I actually used Imagine services for my son and myself way back in 2018. And I am so grateful for the community of people I met. It was because of the other widows in that group that I was able to have a safe space to talk about the loss. And my son, for the first time, was in a space where every child had experienced a death, and he wasn't othered like he was at school. At school, he was the kid whose dad died. And when he came to Imagine, he was the funny kid and he was the artist and he was the one with the curly hair. You couldn't pick him out as the child whose dad died because everyone at Imagine had experienced a death. And I think as educators, we know that what we try to do is create inclusive cultures. But until we have an understanding of how much changes when a loved one dies, it becomes really hard to understand how big that inclusivity needs to be, how long that inclusivity needs to extend for, and the feelings that the people who are grieving are really going through. So it's kind of how I ended up. I didn't immediately jump into the role as executive director here. I did self-work of grief and loss for a while. And then our beautiful founder was transitioning out of the role as executive director, and some of the widows reached out to me and said, "This is the work you should do." And we had recently expanded, Imagine had expanded its services to the city of Newark. And for me, the opportunity to continue to serve our students, but in a different capacity that complemented the work of our schools and didn't just put more on our teachers, felt like the exact right bridge of kind of where my life was guiding me towards. That's how I ended up here. I hope that answers the question.
And I'm sorry about that. I did not realize that.
To worry. One of the things that I didn't know when my husband passed away was just, unfortunately, how common childhood bereavement is. Whenever it happens as a principal or as a teacher, rightfully so, we're truly shocked to our core. I can't believe this happened. We feel all the feelings for the children and for the family. But the truth is that in the state of New Jersey, 1 out of every 13 children will be bereaved before they turn 18. 1 out of every 13. And bereaved due to the death of a parent or a sibling. If you think about the other deaths, the grandparent, the aunt, the uncle, a best friend, I mean, our number is much more than 1 out of every 13. And so in every classroom, in every high school, that means that we have multiple children who are dealing with grief and loss at every moment. And for me, when I heard that number, it just clicked that if we had 1 out of every 13 children in our classroom that needed glasses or needed specialized seating, we would create systems and procedures to be able to better support them. And I think that's the amazing thing about educators is educators, when they know that there is a problem that exists, they figure out amazing ways to be better for their children. And so the idea of grief education, being a high school principal, I realized that we never talk about grief and loss anywhere in the curriculum. Yes, it's sort of blended into SEL, but we call it other things. We call it compassion or empathy, and those are beautiful. But grief and loss and death is a life transition that every single one of us is going to go through, right? Everyone says the only 2 things, I got to pay taxes and die. We know it's going to happen, but our culture is so grief averse that we're afraid to talk about it. And just like all the other things that amazing teachers have tackled, we've learned to talk about sex education. We've learned to talk about our bodies in school. We provide children with tools about abstinence or condoms or all the other ways that we can prevent unwanted things to occur in the course of our lives. We can't prevent grief, but we can be more aware of how to support someone else who's grieving. And that's really what grief education is about. It's knowing and normalizing what the experience of grieving people is and are, and how other people in our lives can show up to help this mental health crisis that has been exacerbated over the past 10, 15 years with social media and all the things. Our kids are more and more alone because we're not having the real conversations about the things that are really bothering them. And grief and loss are one of those. And so our goal at Imagine and through grief education is to normalize the conversations about grief and to give people the tools to do it well and to lean in for each other instead of shying away from those conversations and closing doors.
I'm glad you said that, Lindsay, because that really did foreshadow the question I was going to ask, which is why we should, as school leaders, as teachers, as educators, care about introducing grief counseling into our school programs. I did not even realize that the number was 1 in 13 experience of students experience bereavement before they're 18. That's astounding. And as you pointed out, that's a death of an immediate family member, but that doesn't take into account a lost friend, an accident, a lost teacher. And so it would behoove, and it does behoove us to support our students, and not even our students, but other members of our community through these losses. If we truly do care about all of our students and we want our students to learn academically, they can't even do that if they're not even processing their grief.
That's correct.
On that note, Lindsay, you were saying that there are some things that schools can do and should be doing to normalize the discussion around grief. As executive director of Imagine, what are some ways that you would recommend schools, whether that's administration, whether that's teachers in their own classrooms, whether that's students talking and supporting their friends? What are some things school communities should be doing when it comes to grief counseling?
That's a really great question because every school community is very different. Everybody shows up in different spaces. Some school communities have experienced multiple deaths right now and they're deep in their pain. Some have been fairly lucky, and those have been old age deaths or people dying of kind of more natural causes, and they're less disruptive, but the pain can still be there. I think the first thing, as teachers, we talk about tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 supports. Tier 1 support is something everyone gets, and just a clear, concise understanding of grief and loss. There are so many organizations that do beautiful work in the state of New Jersey. Imagine does professional development, Good Grief does professional development, the Alcove. There's a wonderful website called the NACG, the National Alliance for Children's Grief, and you can find every grief support center and every educational organization. There's also a wonderful website called the Coalition for Grieving Students, which many professional organizations are all a part of, and there's resources and tools there. But the first step is building a common language about grief and loss from the school community. And I always say it starts with administrators. Administrators are the ones who make the policies that help our teachers be able to do what they need to do. And so if administrators know and understand that one of the most important things to understand about grief and loss is like, you have to say something. Many people say, I don't want to upset the child. I don't want to bring it up. Children feel invisible when they have gone through this terrible loss and no one mentions it. And so normalizing that we are going to mention the loss, but we're going to do it by, at Imagine, we say, following the lead of the family. So we reach out to the family, we find out if they have hopes or intentions, where their comfort levels are, and I know how challenging that can be. But if we all share the common best practices about grief and loss, then we're able to adapt it individually for each of our families that are going through that grief. And if you start with administrators, they then can give permission to teachers and mental health professionals to do the right thing. The other thing at times that our children will say is, I'm having so much trouble academically because I'm focused on my loss and what's happening with my mother at home and ripple effects. We always say that the death itself is the primary loss, but that there are so many secondary losses that occur after a death occurs. So our person dies and our now relationship in our household changes. I used to have my mom at home and now she's back at work. And so now I have to get home. And so I can't play soccer anymore, which is another loss because now I'm caring for my 2 younger brothers and sisters. Or I had plans to go to college, but now our financial situation has changed and I can't go to the place I want. And so just that understanding of administrators and adults around our children of how much their life has changed as a result of a death, but many of these losses, we can create that more empathetic culture. So I always say start with tier 1, start with education for everybody. Tier 2 in schools, how do I support the children who are grieving more extensively? And so there's a lot of ways to do that. Provide training and education for mental health professionals within the school to run grief groups effectively within their schools. There are organizations that will come in and do that for you. We can come in and do a course called Grief Mentors, where we work with children who have experienced a loss to provide education to others who maybe have not yet experienced a loss. And that is so empowering for children. At the beginning of this, you talked about resilience and how do children develop resilience. When something traumatic occurs in our children's lives, they either are taught that the world around them is a world they can trust, and so they can continue to lean in and reach out for resources, or the world around them is one that they can't trust. No one showed up for me, and our kids go internal. And both can create different outcomes, but we're more likely to see resilience when our children are met with caring and compassionate educators, a community who understands and hears their needs, and mentors, kids like them who have gone through the loss, who they see have overcome it. And that's where grief mentorship comes in. And third tier is always the specialized support. So partnership with your grief support centers, wherever they are. That NACG website, if you don't know where the grief support centers are within your county or your local areas, you can reach out. New Jersey happens to have 4. We are one of the most densely populated, but we also are right in the middle with the number of bereaved children that we're handling. So we're happy to have that support. And I think that that's it's a complex challenge, but it doesn't have to be when we go at it systematically.
Now, on that note, as you and I are having this conversation, we're in New Jersey. My listeners by now should know that I'm in New Jersey.
Here we are. I love our
in our state, Lindsay, let's be frank, there are certain areas of our state that have an abundance of resources, an abundance of awareness of where to go to get community supports. And then there are communities where either that knowledge is not widely known, or there is a desert of those supports. Or there's the challenge of being able to financially afford some of those supports. How does Imagine take into account the services that it provides when we're not working on a truly equal playing field, if that makes any kind of sense?
Does. Awareness is even a privilege, knowing that the resources exist. A wonderful thing about our services is that Imagine's services, which we call peer-to-peer support, we're not counseling. And that's always a word that people are like, oh, it's grief counseling, right? Counseling means that there's a mental health, that it's an illness or a disorder that you're kind of grappling with. Grief is natural and normal. What grieving people need is they need community. Imagine provides community through peer-to-peer support. And our peer-to-peer support is 100% free. Children come to our center with their families for as long as they want. At any time in their grief journey, they can come back, and those services are 100% free. So that puts a lot of work on us to fundraise and to write grants and to do all of that. Now, our schools, some schools have very robust budgets and can pay all that they can pay for the services. Some schools choose not to pay it, even though they could, because they have other priorities that are happening. So Imagine, one, we write grants to offset the cost to any school district that wants to do the work and can't do the work. They can't afford it right now. So Imagine has grants that can help offset that cost so that the fee for service can be lessened to the school district's budget. That's a wonderful thing. We're so happy to do that. Secondly, Imagine has pulled together a group of national grief leaders. They don't like the word grief expert. None of us ever an expert. We always say that the grieving person is the expert on their grief, that all we can do is learn about grief and translate that information to other people. So we've pulled together a national task force. The first ever family bereavement center was out in Portland, Oregon, called the Dougie Center. They're on our task force. 3 organizations here in New Jersey, the National Association for Children's Grief researchers that are studying how grief and culture align, and they're helping us write a curriculum for the state of New Jersey to address the grief bill. The grief bill is S3330, and that will allow schools to teach about grief and loss for grades 8 through 12 in health classes. Most of the time, the largest impediment for teachers and for school districts is the cost of a curriculum. How are we going to do it? Imagine is creating that curriculum for free. We are going to have that curriculum ready and available starting in January of 2025 so that any teacher in the state of New Jersey can access it 100% for free. This upcoming year, we're going to pilot it with 10 to 15 school districts in the state of New Jersey who can give us feedback on that so that we can revise the curriculum and continue to develop that process. We're also working on professional development that can be given directly to the teachers who would be teaching the lessons, which is different than our general professional development around how to support children coping with loss. But lessons and professional development directly aligned to teaching this curriculum will also begin to make that free into asynchronous videos so that we remove the barriers for districts, for teachers who want to do great work and just don't have the resources to do it. So that's a huge initiative that we're undertaking, and we're going to kind of bear most of the burden of finding the funding so that we can make it accessible for all kids in our state.
And that's good to hear that these services will be available to all students. And even myself, I apologize for calling it counseling because I called it counseling myself. But
Everybody does.
you
Yeah.
made a very valid point. This is a normal part of life.
Yeah. There's a lot of little things in our everyday language that we don't always realize. We say words matter. And when it comes to grief, there's a lot of those little words that thankfully, through listening to people who are grieving, like one of the most frequently used terms that can be really hurtful that most people don't realize is the person committed suicide. You commit crimes, you die by suicide. Those are the normalizing of the language. It's listening to the experience of the people who have unfortunately lived through these tragedies and listen to what's best for them. And at Imagine, we always say, when you know better, you do better. And if we can just spread that little seed out there so that we are less likely to hurt someone more than they're already hurting, that's the thing that we try to do.
So, Lindsay, you touched on the fact that grief happens as a result of death, but not every death is the same. Some are the result of illness, some are the result of accidents. I'm not asking to betray any confidence in terms of what happens at your centers and what's in your curriculum, but could you talk a little bit about what does that face-to-face programming look like with students who might be facing a loss due to illness, an expected loss versus an unexpected loss, and a loss due to suicide?
Great questions. Most of us don't even really ever split the hairs that much where it's, oh, okay, now we're going to talk about specialized support for causes of death. If we could first just normalize supporting people who've had someone die and realize that the tools that we use to support people during death can also be the tools that we use to support people in all those losses that they go through before death. You know, my children, we recently moved. And I didn't think much of it. You know, we were staying in our same town. We moved from one side of town to the other. Yes, my child had to change schools, but we're 5 minutes away from his old friends. The day we moved out of the house, he cried so much. It was a great new house. It was a positive thing. He loved the new place we were moving to, but he also was saying goodbye to something. And I was like, let's say goodbye to the house. Like, let's figure out how we're going to do this. What picture can we take of the house so that it's still here in your new house? And we're not talking about trying to create soft kids, but what we're doing in that moment is we're teaching resilience. We're teaching that you can say goodbye to something that you loved, that that's normal, so that kids don't have to suffocate those feelings when they're going through transitions. A pet loss is one of those early losses that our children go through. They might come to school the next day and their dog died. Those of us who teach 6-year-olds, that is devastating. Now, having not had a dog much in my life, I really dismissed pet loss until I started realizing and watched his toad die. He cried, but what do we do as adults? Don't worry about it. We'll flush it down the toilet. We'll replace the goldfish. We'll get you a new one. Then when a person dies, you can't just get a new one. So helping adults talk about grief and loss is that the culture that adults do is what impacts the way our kids handle all of their losses. Our everyone gets a trophy culture. Learning to lose in sports, it's a good thing. You lose a game, life doesn't always go our way. All of these little early losses help prepare our kids for the big losses in life. And as adults, if we can realize and talk about those early losses, our kids can see that they've overcome many things earlier in their lives. If they don't get into the college that they want, our kids will grieve that loss. They break up with a girlfriend or a boyfriend, they're going to grieve. A best friendship breaks up. Those are losses that are non-death related, but the grief and the feelings that they might go through may be less extreme, but they're all on the spectrum of grief emotions, grief feelings, grief responses that our kids go through.
I hear, and what resonates with what you're saying with me, Lindsay, is our first goal is to really become a society where we norm the discussion around grief. And if we get there, then we could start talking about grief because of different reasons. So that resonated with me. It also resonated with me that, yes, there are many losses in life beyond the final loss or the ultimate loss. And you mentioned some of the big ones: loss of a relationship. You talked about pet loss. And I am going to be a basket case when that happens with my pets. And I have been with the other pets that I've had. That resonated with me, that if we really want to teach our students about resilience, it's really about taking the opportunity to normalize the conversation around grief. So I suppose what I'm interested in knowing is how, once you get students to your centers, what is some of that programming? What does that programming look like? Because if someone doesn't have access to your site, let's say, and they want to start integrating a program in their own school, what can they do? What should they do? And perhaps your programs could serve as an exemplar in some way. Does
Yeah.
that make sense?
It does, yeah. Thank you for grabbing the thread and bringing it back through for me. You asked about the different types of losses. Research on childhood bereavement and childhood grief says is that actually the commonality is the loss, and that we don't need to separate out always the type of loss. That exposure to multiple different types of losses provide children with the opportunity to kind of self-evaluate and see that some people have it better, some people have it worse, and that they get to self-assess and find comfort in their own space. None of us ever want to hear someone say, oh my God, well, so-and-so had it worse than you, when you're dealing with that loss. But it can help children to be exposed to people who have experienced deaths that were very sudden, deaths that were accidental, unfortunately, deaths that were homicide or deaths that were suicide. So we do have mixed loss groups at our centers. There also is stigma that comes along with losses like suicide and homicide that can make them harder for people to talk about. Right now, the percentage is approximately 25% of children who will be bereaved. It will be due to accidental overdose or a suicide. 25% of the childhood bereavement will be a result of those two, which means that at Imagine, we are building out programming that will be specific to losses that are a bit more stigmatized. Because although the first step is building safety within the peer-to-peer support group, our peer-to-peer support groups are run by volunteers. So they do not need a special set of skills other than what they receive in our 3-day training. They go through 3 days of learning how to sit with grief and be comfortable being uncomfortable, like learning to just sit. And then there's skills that we teach for these adults who facilitate the groups. One of them is, first and foremost, it's mindset work. Nothing needs to be fixed for our children. If they are crying in group, great, they're processing their loss. Your job isn't to fix it and to clean it up and to make them feel better. Your job is to create a safe space for them to express themselves and that our children can have all their feelings. So every night at Imagine, the first thing our children do is we pass a talking stick around the room where our children share their name, the name of the person who died. And there's a rule at Imagine that you can always pass. Your story is your story. You never have to do any of the grief exercises, grief activities that we engage with. When you're ready, you will. And sometimes we get more just from listening to each other. So our children pass a talking stick around the room, and then we do grief activities each week. And so some of those are memory boxes where we bring in things about the person that we love. Some of them are food related. What's your favorite recipe? What's your favorite thing that you've cooked? We have a series of grief activities that we do. And we always evolve these activities because our kids have been with us for many times, that we have a workbook that has quite a few of them. Some is grief is a journey, and our kids do a drawing of what their grief has looked like. And they get to mark the highs in their grief journey and the lows in their grief journey. They do a grief playlist. What are the songs that you like to listen to when you're grieving? And so all of these activities that we do with our children, we call them just opening doors. And if our children walk through the door and tell us more about it, that is a beautiful thing. And if all they did was sit in the room and listen to everyone else share their story, they got so much out of that that we know that like they will come back. And so you're doing your job if you are learning to listen to a child who's grieving, that you lean in and you open doors for our children, and that you show up with compassion, and that you realize that it's not your job to take their pain away. It's your job to sit there and let them know that you are a safe person where they can share that pain. Lots of activities, but I do recommend for any educator who wants to do this work is that they do some self-work first, that they realize what archetypes, what like stereotypes about grief and loss am I carrying with me? And Imagine offers free webinars. So anyone in the state can pop into our once a month webinar. We do webinars on understanding children's grief and talking to children about death and dying that will help make sure that you don't do more damage because you haven't done your self-work. Thanks for that question.
As you were talking, Lindsay, and we don't have really a lot of time to go into this, but I'm intrigued how different societies approach this. So when you were talking about a memory box or some sort of physical manifestation of the relationship that we had with that person, it really reminded me of my time teaching in Japan and families that had family altars. Each family was honoring their family that was no longer physically present in their home. And then there are also days of worship, holidays.
Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead.
Exactly, down in Mexico as well. And that does seem much healthier to, again, not hide it, but to discuss it and to get those feelings out where we can express them.
We say that there's like really an intersectional lens on grief. Not only your upbringing impacts it, your family dynamic impacts it, your religion, your culture, your age, your socioeconomic, and then the culture you're in impacts your loss and grief too. And those can be highly complex. One of the first things that a family does when they come to Imagine is that they have an opportunity, one, to tell their story, and two, we normalize the word grief. So grief is all the feelings you feel about a loss. And normalizing that you actually sometimes could be happy that someone has passed on. That's an okay thing. Maybe your dad was really mean. One of the other words that you won't hear us use when we're working with our clients, we won't use the word loved one unless they've chosen to use it. And the loved one is an assumption that this person now, because they've died, they're glorified. This was your loved one. What if you guys really mean? You can have complicated feelings about loss. And so we just normalize that right off the bat for families and say, like, is there any part, are you angry? You can be angry at a person who died. And our cultural beliefs, sometimes your culture tells you you can't. And so Imagine is totally non-denominational. We don't ascribe to any specific cultural belief, but all of those beliefs are welcome. And so as we do this, our families then have the opportunity to memorialize the person who died. And so they choose stars, leaves, snowflakes, and we have seasons all over our center. And our families are encouraged to write a message to the person who died and mark them in our center. And so many of our schools adopt that in their counseling offices, their guidance offices, as an opportunity to say, when you come back to school, you have the option to add your person, and we use your person, to our memory tree. And that normalizes, it creates a space, just like funerals do and just like wakes do in all different cultures, where in our school community, we remember the people in our lives that we want to remember who have passed on. And here's how we do that here. And children never have to do it, but the opportunity for them to do it helps them see that in this school, look how many other people. Children's Grief Awareness Day, it alternates, but it's usually the third Thursday in the month of November. And so many schools can be invited to recognize Children's Grief Awareness Day and to do things to honor those in our lives who have died. Doesn't have to be on Mother's Day or Father's Day, because those can bring up so many mixed emotions. Some people are thrilled, some people are sad, but when you do it on a day that just acknowledges loss and grief and welcomes everyone, no matter who it is who has died, that's a really nice way to be fully inclusive and to help children realize that their grief is seen and that they have a space to express it.
That is quite powerful. Are there any schools that you have worked with that you feel have done an amazing job of providing grief support?
It usually starts with a champion. There's one person in the school who decides that this is important. The resources are there, and all of the children bereavement centers, we want to be there to help. I have a unique background because I know and understand education. Schools that want to do this well, there are countless resources that are out there for partnership. Grief isn't something that you're going to get immediately. If you think about implementing a new program like a phonics program or a new math curriculum, there's a lot of change management that goes into that. Baby steps. Start with yourself. See if you can get a group of people to go through a training together. One of our schools is using a group of students and they're getting the education. And then we build from there. So you can go very grassroots and do it with just a small population and watch the 10%, the FedEx effect occur, and you're going to take over grief in the school. Sometimes it happens when there's been a tragedy or a trauma in the school. So imagine, in addition to providing education and grief support, we show up when someone has died and our school community does not know what to do and they're looking for grief support. We provide community-based responses. And that's often a time when schools realize, okay, we didn't know what to do. Can you help us through this process? And then we see more buy-in from administrators and PTAs. But all of the resources are there, I think, from our unique lens and the collaboration around our state and our country. And over the next few years, go slow, give yourself grace because you're going to make mistakes through the process. You're going to unpack some of your own grieving, but it will help all of us show up better for our children and help with the mental health crisis that our children are going through right now.
Lindsay, is there anything we haven't discussed?
One of the most important things to know about grief and loss is that it's lifelong. It's really normal for a child to be grieving for a while, and that their grief, the support that they need, lasts much longer than we would initially think or even maybe want or have the stamina to do. And so you can't do it alone. You have to have someone that you can talk it all through with, that you can't carry. You can't fix everyone's grief, but you can know and acknowledge that the grief is going to be there for a period of time. And that if you do your self-work, you can show up better for kids through that.
Lindsay, thank you for that. Where can people find out more information about you and the work that you do?
Our website is www.imaginenj.org. Our website has links to all. And the wonderful thing I would encourage is to sign up for the newsletter. We send out a newsletter every month that has links to all of our free webinars, free resources, connections that you can learn more about this work. Thank you so much. Come and find us.
Thank you, Lindsay, for your time. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Take care.
Bye-bye. Thank you for listening today. I hope you got some great tips that you can bring back into your teaching. Remember, have a life teaching without sacrificing your own. Also, don't forget to subscribe and be well.